Today, I am breaking down the combine drills that are going to determine who the Falcons are taking in round one.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, your very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more and place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, by visiting fanduel.com/locked on today to get started. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today we are following up yesterday's episode where I went through and previewed all of the offensive position groups and sort of the guys that are expected to test well and what metrics and drills I pay attention to. We'll do something similar with the defense on today's episode, but we'll kind of tailor it towards the idea that, you know, the Falcons are probably going to use their number one pick on a defensive player, potentially an edge rusher, potentially a cornerback, and sort of what is going to be meaningful that will help determine that. And so let's start talking about the edge rusher position, which is going to get the bulk of the attention, I think, from Falcon fans until here in the draft. And let's talk about a couple of the edge rushers that were part of Bruce Feldman's freak list from this past summer. There were 10 edge rushers on that freak list, including Myles Murphy, the Clemson defensive end, who was number 3 on the freaks list, who is, you know, projected to potentially to be the Falcons' number 1 pick this year. And Myles Murphy is local to Atlanta, I think Marietta, Georgia. We learned today at his combine presser that both of his parents are season ticket holders for the Falcons. So certainly I think it would make, you know, some of his family members very happy to see him land here in Atlanta. But, you know, Murphy is alleged to run, you know, a 40 in the 4.5 range, you know, have a 35-inch vertical, a 10-foot broad jump, all good numbers for an edge rusher that you would want to take high. And, you know, this goes back to a conversation and some statements that Terry Fontenot, the Falcons general manager, said yesterday at his combine presser, talking about the value of workouts, right? That it allows you to have an apples to apples comparison between players within a draft class and from previous draft classes and future draft classes. But I think within the draft class, it's meaningful because it can allow guys to create separation, like within these stacks of players. Like we look at the top of the draft in terms of edge rushers projected to go in round 1. You know, Will Anderson out of Alabama is probably in a stack by himself. And I do wonder if Will Anderson will work out at this year's combine, or does he do what typically, you know, guys that are generally seen as locks to be top 5 picks and skip the combine workouts and just wait to his pro day. So that will be something to keep an eye on. Tyree Wilson out of Texas Tech is another guy that is kind of in that stack alongside Myles Murphy right after Will Anderson. And from what I've heard, you know, he's dealing with an injury and probably won't work out, may wait till his pro day. So we'll see if that's the case. But, you know, along with Wilson, along with Murphy, another player that is often mentioned as a potential top 10 pick at the edge rusher position is Iowa's Lukas Van Ness. And from hearing a Dane Brugler out of The Athletic on a podcast earlier this week, suggesting that Van Ness is going to test very well. So that will be something to keep an eye on, and sort of how these guys test could help them within that stack. If we're putting Wilson, Van Ness, and Murphy in a similar stack, the guy that's going to be the plus athlete, the better athlete, may move to the top of that stack. And that will, impact the Falcons, draft selection, especially if they're, the team that's going to wind up taking the number 2 edge rusher off the board after Will Anderson. And then you think about, how, these testing will affect the stack probably for guys that are maybe late first round or early second round type of guys. Players like BJ Ojolari out of LSU, Nolan Smith out of Georgia, Will McDonald out of Iowa State, Keon White out of Georgia Tech. How those guys test, could solidify those guys as first round picks. Or, if they don't test particularly well, maybe teams will be like, you know what, we can wait and get that guy in round 2 or something like that. And it's notable that McDonald and Keon White were also on Bruce Feldman's freak list this past summer. But that allows us to get into a conversation of what are going to be some of the metrics and drills that these guys can perform at a high level that is going to get them drafted higher. And it goes back to a conversation we had on this podcast last year when we were previewing the combine, that basically then I looked back at all the first and second round edge rushers that had been drafted since 2010, so through the 2021 draft, and looked at their sort of career sack totals averaged out per season, and looked at their height, weight, arm length, 40 time, 3-cone, short shuttle, and broad jump to see how it correlates with that sack production. And we have to give the disclaimer that, correlation is not causation, but it was notable that 3 drills stood out above the noise as, having a mildly high correlation to sack production. And that was the 3-cone, that was the short shuttle, and that was the broad jump. However, it was notable doing further research that the correlation was different between, the first and second round. Like for the first round players, 3-cone was most notable, then it was short shuttle, then it was broad jump, but they were all kind of grouped together in terms of similar correlation coefficients. But then when you got to the second round, it was like short shuttle, then there was a big drop off to 3-cone, and then there was an even a bigger drop off to the broad jump. And so less of a correlation. And so my conclusion, doing a little bit more digging and looking at that second round data, I think some of the lesser correlations there is owed to that 2 of the more productive sack artists that were taken in round 2 over the last 12 years were DeMarcus Lawrence with the Cowboys and Carlos Dunlap, currently I think with the Chiefs, but formerly with the Cincinnati Bengals. And those were 2 players that did not necessarily test great, but yet have produced at a high level in the NFL. And so I think that's kind of throwing off some of the correlation numbers in that regard. But this gets kind of to the heart of the draft and the heart of why, the combine matters. And we kind of touched upon this yesterday when we talked about how, relative athletic score, RAS, that there is a very high percentage of NFL players that test well. Right. And it boils down to the very nature of drafting, which we continue to say, and we'll always say that the draft is a crapshoot. And what is a crapshoot? It's basically gambling. And that's basically what NFL teams are doing. Like, this information basically is telling me that teams are betting on higher end athletes in round 1 versus in round 2. Right. And it's basically a matter of where teams are willing to draft guys. The earlier they are, basically that's telling us that they're willing to make bigger bets on those guys, right? They're willing to make bigger bets on the plus athletes. And it's not, again, going back to the point of correlation is not causation. It's not that high-end athletes are, it predicts that those guys are going to be successful in the NFL, but typically successful players in the NFL tend to be high-end athletes. And that's basically the takeaway from this. And so obviously this has connections to the Falcons, who are picking 8th, which indicates that they should be willing to take an even bigger bet on a higher end athlete than maybe a team that is picking 24th or so in the draft. And that's going to be important at this edge rusher position, or really any position, that you want to walk away feeling good about your bet because we're betting on a particularly high-end athlete. And so, should the Falcons take a Tyree Wilson, a Lukas Van Ness, or a Myles Murphy, you want to see these guys test well over this weekend so that you can feel a little bit better about that bet. Because again, just because they test well does not mean that they'll go on to be successful in the NFL, but you'll feel a lot better like, oh, this guy's not going to be the outlier, the exception of the Carlos Dunlap or the DeMarcus Lawrence, the guy that doesn't test particularly well, that has to go on and sort of overachieve in the NFL based off of that testing. So we'll see how that goes with those guys. But in terms of the other guys that were also Feldman freaks this past summer that will be at the combine, you have DJ Johnson out of Oregon, Andre Carter out of Army, Dylan Horton, TCU, Tommy Adebawore from Northwestern, Isaiah Land from Florida A&M, Nick Hampton from App State, and Yaya Diaby from Louisville. Isaiah Foskey out of Notre Dame was on the freak list the previous summer in 2021. And then there's other players that were not Feldman freaks, but are players that I've heard will probably test well. Derek Hall out of Auburn, Mike Morris out of Michigan. And Mike Morris is notable because he hasn't gotten a lot of love in this pre-draft process, and maybe could change the narrative a little bit at the combine this week, because Morris is notable because he's listed at like 290 pounds. And so we know that the Falcons are probably going to prefer heavier edges, given Ryan Nielsen's scheme and wanting to play with lighter boxes and wanting guys that are like 265 plus. And so Mike Morris definitely is that at 290. And, if he tests particularly well, maybe he could be a guy that the Falcons can turn to on day 2 of the draft if they are to pass on a pass rusher at the top of the draft. So keep an eye on Mike Morris. But, in addition to 3-cone, short shuttle, and broad jump, other metrics I will be paying attention to, because I do expect the Falcons to want, bigger ends, is, how these guys weighing in. So basically, if these guys come in at sub 260, I don't know if they're going to be particularly high on the Falcons draft board. And I'm also going to pay attention to arm length, because the Saints typically preferred, under Nielsen, longer armed pass rushers that can stack and shed at the point of attack against the run, as well as use that length to generate pass rush moves as well. So arm length, weight, 3-cone, short shuttle, and broad jump are going to be the 5 pillars, the 5 boxes that we're hoping that whoever the Falcons wind up drafting at that edge rusher position will wind up checking. But edge rusher is not the only position that the Falcons may pull the trigger on in the first round. And so we'll continue today's combine preview looking at the other position, in the cornerback position, and talk about the drills that matter there as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But it is past the midway point of the NBA season, and it is a perfect time for you guys to check out FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And new customers to FanDuel will get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. And that means you get bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win, and you can use that to bet point spreads or money lines. I like parlays because it means you can bet a little and win a lot. And FanDuel has a parlay builder for the NBA where you can kind of pick and choose the players that you want to bet on based off of how many points, assists, and rebounds you think they can get, right? And you can check that out by heading over to fanduel.com/lockedon. And of course, that's the place to go to get in on your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. So head on over to fanduel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk about the cornerback position. And, I think it's notable because going back to comments Terry Fontenot made yesterday, and comments that he's basically made any chance he's had to speak to the media, classic Terry. But, whenever he's asked about, the Falcons pass rush, he always talks about the coverage, right? Well, the only way, it's not just getting better pass rushers. You can also enhance your pass rush by getting better coverage. And, part of me wonders how much we should read into this. A big part of me, the cynical part of me, which is 90% of my body, about from here down, it's all cynicism. Just thinks this is Terry in his supervillain persona that we touched upon in a previous episode, where he's like, throwing smoke bombs and going, "You'll never catch me, Batman," in terms of like never wanting people to be able to figure out what the Falcons' plans are going to do. So if you're talking to him about pass rushers, he's going to bring up corners, right? If you're, and you see this whenever they talk about players on the roster. It's like, hey, we love Desmond Ridder, but we're going to add to the cornerback position. Hey, we love Tyler Algier, but we're going to still look like we're going to get better running backs. And so that's just sort of Terry throwing down his smoke bomb and being coy and cagey about what the team is going to do. But it is worth noting, because maybe, just maybe, he's not being coy and cagey and trying to, "Ooh, Batman, you'll never catch me." Maybe he is, leaking a little bit of information, and it'll be interesting to look back, 2 months from now, and be like, oh, Terry was kind of telling us all along that they value the cornerback position and not just are looking to invest in the edge rusher. And so that leads us to, if the Falcons do wind up pulling trigger on a cornerback at 8, sort of who are some of the guys that they may be looking for. And notably, again, we'll go back to Bruce Feldman's freaks list. There were 6 corners on that list over the summer, and one of those was Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon, who is widely considered to be the top corner and could be a Falcons target at 8. Devon Witherspoon out of Illinois was not on Bruce Feldman's freaks list. And we've kind of touched upon kind of the dichotomy between Gonzalez and Witherspoon, and why Gonzalez is kind of the classic type of corner that gets drafted in the top 10 and Witherspoon is not. And that's due to the fact that cornerback is a height, weight, speed kind of position. And while I didn't necessarily run the numbers in terms of the correlation in terms of production, because, I don't know if it's quite the same of trying to correlate interceptions as it is with sacks to corners as it is with defensive ends. But I did run the correlations on where guys are picked, right? When looking at their height, weight, 40 time, arm length, 3-cone, short shuttle, broad jump, and all that stuff and more. And the conclusion was that, the big fast corners tend to get drafted first, right? No surprise there. Like the metric that had the highest correlation was height, which is understandable. You want to get bigger at the cornerback position, followed by weight, followed by 40 time, which barely edged out arm length, right? And it's notable, especially when you look at guys like Gonzalez and Witherspoon, what they're going to measure at the combine is going to be meaningful, right? And you look at Gonzalez, who's listed at 6'2", 200. Where does he come in? Around there. Witherspoon, in contrast, is 6 foot 184. Right. And so you look at the measurables and you say, hey, Joey Porter Jr. out of Penn State at 6'2", 200. Maybe he is a guy that could leapfrog Witherspoon if it's a height, weight, speed position. Kelee Ringo, who, in season was being consistently mocked as the top corner in the top 10, is like 6'2", 210. Right. And that's one of the reasons why. And he was, by the way, number 6 on Feldman's freaks list over the summer. And I ran the numbers, and the average top 10 corner since 2010 on average was 6 foot, 200 pounds with nearly 32.5-inch arms. And it'll be interesting to sort of look at, the height, weight, and arm length of some of these top corners in the draft that may help or hurt their stock, right? And what's notable, given that we know the weight and 40 time, actually the metric that correlated even more than height did in terms of draft stock was speed score. And speed score is basically a weight adjusted 40 time, right? And so that, again, reiterates the point that, it's all about being big and fast at the cornerback position, which is going to get you drafted earlier. Teams are going to, again, going back to the notion of teams are going to, making bets on these first round corners. They will make a bet. They will make a bigger bet on the big fast corner than on the small, slow corner. Right. And so for a player like Devon Witherspoon, who doesn't necessarily check the classic boxes in terms of being the tallest guy or the heaviest guy, it may not even be the fastest guy, because there are reports that Gonzalez is going to run in the 4.3 range. And I know Ringo's going to run fast. He'll probably also run in 4.3 lane. I do wonder a little bit about what Witherspoon and Porter's top end speed is going to be. So that will be something to keep an eye on. But for Witherspoon, just being heavy on the scales, being a certain poundage is going to impact his draft stock, because if he does measure in at under 185 pounds, that is going to be notable, right? If he's only 184, right? Because over the last 12 years, there's only been one sub 185 pound corner taken in round 1, and that was also one of the exceptions when it came to not having the biggest top 10 corner, and that was Denzel Ward, who went 4th overall, I think in 2018, to the Cleveland Browns, and he was 183 pounds, right? And what's notable about Denzel Ward is, even though he wasn't the biggest guy or the longest guy, he had about 31.25-inch arms, which is about roughly league average in that regard at the cornerback position. But he ran extremely fast. Ran a 4.3 240, which is 97th percentile among the cornerback position. He had a 136 inch broad jump, which is 98th percentile. So, Ward wasn't the biggest guy, but, he certainly was fast, right? And so I think we'll have to see Witherspoon, who's probably not going to be the biggest guy, but certainly if he comes in at like 188 or 190, that will help his stock, and certainly his arm length will matter. And I don't want to see what happened with Trent McDuffie last year happen to Devon Witherspoon, right? And McDuffie was a guy that I, saw right neck and neck with guys like Sauce Gardner and Derek Stingley, as one of the top corners in last year's draft class, and thought he was in the mix for the Falcons at that 8th overall draft selection. But then he shows up at the combine and has super short arms, right? 29-inch arms, sub 30-inch arms, and basically he became the first and only corner with sub 30-inch arms, at least since 2010, to be drafted in the first round last year. Now, he went on to have a very productive rookie season and was very good for the Chiefs this year on the way to the Super Bowl. But he was a guy that went from a potential top 10 pick to 21st overall. And so hopefully for Devon Witherspoon's sake, we're not having this conversation, in part due to it's going to hurt the brand, because over the last month, you've been hearing me talk on this podcast a number of times about shooting my shot in terms of who the Falcons pick is going to be. And Devon Witherspoon has been that guy. And I don't want to be talking a week from now being like, well, he's probably not going to be a top 10 pick because he was 184 pounds and he had like 30 in 5/8 inch arms or something like that. So we'll sort of see how Witherspoon tests and if he measures up compared to some of these other top corners. And it also begs the question of, does this even matter to a team like the Atlanta Falcons, right? Especially when it comes to first round picks, because we just don't have a lot of data to indicate how much the Falcons value athleticism. We knew when Dan Quinn was here that athleticism was a big thing. It was all about broad jumps and 40 times, right? We don't really know that with this regime quite yet, because we just don't have an abundance of data off of 2 drafts to really go one. There's data that indicates they do care about athleticism, and there's data that tells you that they don't necessarily care too much about athleticism. And you look at that with the first round picks. Got Kyle Pitts, we all know was a plus athlete, but Drake London was not. Now, Drake London still made sense for the Falcons because he was a very good scheme fit in terms of being that closer to that classic X wide receiver for the Falcons to pull the trigger for him at that 8th overall draft selection. And one wonders, will a similar conversation apply to the cornerback position, right? Do they go for the plus athlete like a Christian Gonzalez, or do they go for the guy that may not be quite the athlete like a Devon Witherspoon, but is a great scheme fit or something like that? So I don't know. We'll find out in several weeks, on that front, but we'll time will tell on that issue. But we'll move on, mention the other sort of corners that were on Feldman's Freaks list. That was Riley Moss out of Iowa, DJ Turner out of Michigan, Travius Hodges-Tomlinson out of TCU, and Jacorian Bennett out of Maryland. And it was notable that in Feldman's write-up, he mentioned that DJ Turner could potentially break the record for the fastest 3-cone ever at the combine, which is 6.28, set by I think Jordan Thomas somewhere around 2010. I can't remember the exact year. And so if that's the case, then somewhere Thomas Dimitroff is rolling in his grave, because he loves an incredible 3-cone. So we'll see if DJ Turner can light up the combine and light up the Thomas Dimitroff's coffin. I know he's still alive, but he's dead to all of us. Right. So we'll see how that goes, but we'll move on from cornerback and talk about positions that probably aren't going to be in the mix for the Falcons at the 8th overall, but certainly will be in the mix for the Falcons with later round picks. And that includes D tackles, linebackers, and safeties, what metrics matter, who's going to stand out. And we'll talk about Jalen Carter's newfound legal issues as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But of course, if you want to get even more information on this year's draft class, Locked On Falcons, it shouldn't be your first listen. But we do our best. But you should definitely make up for it by making Locked On NFL Draft your second listen. Check out hosts Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez of the Draft Network breaking down every single day this upcoming draft class. And so you could, of course, can find Locked On NFL Draft on your preferred podcast platform. So let's talk about the D tackle position, and let's talk about, the topic of the day, at least in the combine circles, and that is Jalen Carter and his newfound legal issues. And so we'll see, if this becomes the biggest story coming out of the combine. And for those of you that don't know, Jalen Carter warrants were issued for Jalen Carter's arrest today due to his alleged involvement in the fatal car crash that took the lives of his former Georgia teammate Devon Witherspoon back in January, as well as a Georgia staffer in Chandler LaCroix. And the main bullet points is that he's alleged to have been involved with racing LaCroix, who was driving the other car that crashed, and she was allegedly driving drunk. And he gave some conflicting reports to police. And so, he's apparently leaving Indianapolis and headed back to Georgia to resolve this. He released a statement, indicating his innocence and all that. But he's charged with reckless driving and racing, 2 misdemeanor charges, but certainly it's something that, seriously could, impact his draft stock. And I will admit that, the lizard part of my brain, sort of immediately when I saw this news was like, how does this affect his draft stock? How does this affect the, Falcons draft pick? But then sort of the higher parts of my brain, the human part of my brain, the part that has empathy, kind of kicked in and was like, okay, like, is that really that important, given the circumstances, and in sort of what, Jalen Carter's going through, what the LaCroix family and Willock families potentially are going through. So, but I'm sure for a lot of you guys listening, that part of your brain maybe has not necessarily kicked in yet. And so let's talk about, let's answer the question that I'm sure, you lizard people are all seeking for. How does this affect his draft stock? And what does this mean for the Falcons? Could he fall to the Falcons? I don't know, guys. Right. And that's owed to, how, the top 8 teams picking in his draft, including the Falcons, how they deal with character issues. Is you got to take it by team or case by case basis, right? I can say in general, NFL teams tend to not care about character as much when it comes to extremely talented football players, and certainly I think Jalen Carter qualifies as that. So we'll see how this process plays out, not only the legal process but the draft process. And so we'll just have to figure it out. I don't have an answer for you. Could this cause him to fall in the draft? Sure. Could it not? Sure. Time will tell on that issue. And you go back to last year's draft class where, throughout the entire pre-draft process, everybody was questioning Kayvon Thibodeau's character. And I guess technically he fell in the draft because some people thought he was the best player in last year's draft, just like some people think Jalen Carter's the best player in this year's draft. And Kayvon Thibodeau went 5 overall. So I guess he fell from 1 to 5 due to character. But, who knows if that is going to affect Jalen Carter in a similar way. So we'll just sort of have to see. But it goes back to a conversation we just had just recently on Monday's episode on Mock Draft Monday, talking about the idea of trading up for Jalen Carter. We mentioned, Todd McShay talking about Jalen Carter having questioning character concerns. And Todd McShay said this in December, about a month before this car crash. So he wasn't alluding to this, although details did emerge that, Jalen Carter had a speeding ticket back in September. So I don't know if that was part of what Todd McShay was pointing out. But the point of that episode was Todd McShay's statement was the only data point that we had indicating that Jalen Carter has character concerns. And today we got a second data point. So we'll see how it all plays out for Jalen Carter. But I don't have the answer that I'm sure some of you guys want me to have at this point in time. But let's move on and talk about the other D tackles that will be in Indianapolis. We'll have a chance to shine. And, number 1 on Feldman's Freaks list was a D tackle. That was Michigan nose tackle Mazi Smith. And that's due to the fact that, he's reportedly at 337 pounds, ran a 6.95 3-cone. And for comparison's sake, going back and crunching the numbers for first-round corners, the average first-round corner over the last 12 years ran a 6.89 3-cone, and the average first-round corner is only 196 pounds. So basically, Mazi Smith has comparable change of direction to a first-round corner, and can do so with another 140 pounds of bulk on his frame. So I am skeptical of this. So I'll believe it when I see it. It just sounds impossible to me. And, while I wasn't a huge fan of Mazi Smith on film, in part due to I was expecting to see this freakish athlete and I didn't see that. I also wasn't a huge fan of Jordan Davis, although I would say I was probably a bigger fan of Jordan Davis at this point than I am of Mazi Smith, who I kind of see as a 3rd round pick. And Jordan Davis was able to changed the narrative after his freakish combine. So we'll see if Mazi Smith can kind of do the same thing this year, and he's the talk of the town a week from now. But based off of these reported numbers, he should be right. He should be an absolute freak. So we'll see how that goes. But other freaks on Feldman's list from this summer at D tackle were, of course, my guy from Pitt, Kalijah Cansey, and the questions around him are going to be about his size. How tall is he? How big is he? Is he shorter than 6 foot? Is he under 280 pounds? Those are all going to be questions for him. Brian Bresee, the consistent number 2 D tackle behind Jalen Carter out of Clemson, was also on the freaks list, and it does feel like Bresee's stock has kind of been sliding the last month or so, and so we'll see if he can kind of change the narrative on him and re-solidify himself as the top 10 pick that he was being mocked as 2-3 months ago. Jervon Dexter out of Florida is the other D tackle on the freaks list, and similar to the edge rusher position, I will be paying attention to arm length at this position, where the Saints consistently drafted D tackles that tended to have at least average arm length or above 33-inch arms or whatever. So that will be sort of a threshold I'll be paying attention to. But I don't think like edge rusher, testing is as meaningful for D tackles as it is for edge rushers, just because, it's less of a you can just out athlete guys. It's a power based position as opposed to a just like, hey, let's be the fastest, most explosive guy there. But no one's going to complain about explosiveness and athleticism. So speaking of explosiveness and athleticism, let's talk about the linebacker position, because there were 3 linebackers on Feldman's freak list, and it was all due to speed. It was Owen Popoe out of Auburn, Trenton Simpson out of Clemson, and both of those guys were alleged to run 40s in the 4.3 range. So we'll see if they can blaze that time. Noah Sewell out of Oregon was also noted for, I think, his fast miles per hour. Other non-freaks that are expected to test well: Drew Sanders out of Arkansas, who's in contention with Simpson for LB1 in this draft class. And I'm also curious to see Jack Campbell out of Iowa, who I think a lot of people sort of dismiss as, oh, he's like a blue collar guy out of Iowa, he's not a top end athlete. But I've heard things from various people mentioning that he may surprise some folks with how athletic he is, and he does seem like a pretty decent athlete on film. So we'll see how that shows up in him. And when it comes to the linebacker position, you go back to the Saints historically have tended to gravitate, especially since 2017, towards high-end athletes with their draft picks, and that's been a big reason why they've been so successful drafting over the last 6-7 years. But it seemed like that is a general rule of thumb in terms of gravitating towards high-end athletes, but it seemed especially true at the linebacker position when you look at some of the Saints' recent acquisitions and draft picks. Alex Anzalone, Demario Davis, Pete Warner, Caden Ellis were all 8+ in terms of their RAS, their relative athletic score, meaning that they were 80th percentile or better athletes. Stephon Anthony, even before 2017, was like a 9.9 RAS. Martez Wilson was a 9.9 RAS. So it does feel like the Saints value athleticism, and we'll see if Ryan Nielsen brings that over to Atlanta. But at the same time, based off of what limited data we have about the Falcons' preferences at linebacker with Troy Anderson, who was a 10.0 RAS, basically meaning he's the most perfect athlete that's ever existed, it does seem like the Falcons already valued athleticism, and that seems to be a trend in the league overall, that when you look at the back of the last 3 or so drafts in terms of the first round linebackers, you have guys like Quay Walker, Jamin Davis, Devin Lloyd, Zaven Collins, Isaiah Simmons, Kenneth Murray have all been first round picks that were really, really high end athletes. Micah Parsons, of course, is also in that mix as well. So it does feel like the Falcons are following, similar patterns as Saints and the rest of the league in terms of targeting athletes. And we'll see how that affects if they do target a linebacker at some point in this draft. But let's wrap up by talking about the safety position. And again, there were 3 freaks on Feldman's list due to their speed. That was Sidney Brown out of Illinois, Brian Branch out of Alabama, and Jair Brown out of Penn State. And Branch is notable because he is projected as the top safety, the consensus top safety. And I'll be very curious to see how he tests, just because conventionally Alabama isn't necessarily known for producing a lot of high-end athletes at the safety position historically. Like Minkah Fitzpatrick is kind of the lone exception when you look at the list of Alabama safeties that have been drafted over the years in terms of their athleticism. And Branch is often compared to Minkah Fitzpatrick due to them playing very similar positions, the same position at Alabama and projected moving forward. And Minkah was considered one of the top talents in his draft class, but then kind of fell out of the top 10. And that's a similar vibe with Brian Branch, and he can really sort of solidify himself in the top half of the round one if he tests well. But in general, I don't tend to pay that much attention to testing when it comes to safeties, just because it's much more of a cerebral position than, some of these other defensive positions where you just kind of want to get the best athlete in there. But, it kind of depends on what you want in safety. If you're looking for sort of a guy that's going to, play a lot of slot corner, you do probably want to bet on, athletic traits there as opposed to a guy that's just going to be parked deep in your secondary. But we'll see sort of that. And there's certainly a reality, a universe. I hope we're not living in this universe, but there's a universe where the Falcons don't wind up, doing whatever it takes to get Jessie Bates this offseason, and therefore, looking for that center fielder for the Falcons defense that we expect Jessie Bates to fill, may have to turn towards the draft to find that type of player. And if that's the case, I will start to pay a little bit more attention to how some of these guys test over this weekend, just because when we talked about Jessie Bates before, he's one of the better center fielding safeties in the NFL. And you look at some of the other guys that are high end center fielders, they tend to run well, right? Like, you don't have to be a blazing fast guy, but, being a good center fielder usually means you have good range. And so, like, basically, if you can hit 4.5 or below, like Minkah Fitzpatrick or Javon Holland did, that's a promising side. And then you look at some of the guys that didn't necessarily hit that number, like Justin Simmons and Marcus Williams, that are also high-end center fielders. They didn't run fast, but they did jump well, right? They were very explosive with their broad jumps and whatnot. And so that also contributes to the explosiveness you need if you're going to be that center fielder, to be able to break and make those, show that range and whatnot. So those will be, 40 time and broad jumps will probably be two metrics that I will pay more attention to in the coming weeks if the Falcons don't do #whatever it takes to get Jessie Bates. But we'll see if we have to go down that, darkest timeline here on Locked On Falcons. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Tomorrow, guys, we'll be doing a free agent Friday, and I'll probably just focus on the front 7 free agents on the defensive side of the ball that I would like, if I was basically kidnapping Terry Fontenot and taking over his job and locking Ryan Pace in the bathroom, and running the Falcons organization. We'll go through the various defensive free agents in the front 7 that I would sign. So that will be probably what we'll do on tomorrow's episode, and we'll save, a whole Jessie Bates centric episode of Free Agent Friday till the Friday after next. But before we wrap up, I do want to mention another player that I didn't realize until today that I forgot to mention on yesterday's episode when talking about the players that could potentially run the fastest 40 at the combine. And that was Darius Davis, the wide receiver out of TCU. He can probably throw his hat in the ring in terms of guys alongside Jalen Hyatt and Tyler Scott and Devon Achane that, may wind up blazing the fastest 40s this weekend. So keep an eye on Darius Davis. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Of course, if you want to get more information on who's going to shine and who did shine, of course, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. We'll be, reviewing the combine early next week. But of course, make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft as your second listen, because Keith and Damian probably know a little bit more than I do at this point in time about who are the best players. So make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft as your second listen wherever you get your podcasts.